Jean Shepard was not the most famous woman in country music. She didn't have more hit songs than those who came after her. But there was one thing Nashville could never ignore. Jean Shepard stayed longer than all of them. When new voices replaced the old. When country music became glossier, more commercial, easier to listen to. When women were still treated as a footnote in a man's story. Jean Shepard did not disappear, and she did not fight to be noticed. She simply stood there, year after year, on the same stage that so many others touched only for a fleeting moment. And that in turn raises an uncomfortable question. What do you have to give up to remain in one place for more than half a century without ever becoming the center of the spotlight? This is not a story about a dazzling career. It is a story about the cost of loyalty and why sometimes staying is the loneliest choice of all. Jean Shepard was born in 1933 in a poor rural stretch of Oklahoma, a place where life offered very little room for choice and even less space for prolonged dreaming. Jean's childhood was not shaped by grand aspirations, but by very concrete limits. A working-class family, strict discipline, and the quiet understanding that each passing day demanded endurance before it ever allowed the thought of moving forward. There, people didn't ask who you wanted to become. They only cared whether you were strong enough to make it to tomorrow. Music came to Jean in a very different way. It was not a romantic escape, nor a dream of the stage. Music was a language of survival, a way to give voice to things no one had time to hear. The only means of keeping emotion from being pressed down until it finally shattered inside a life too narrow to hold it. It was within that environment that a very specific psychological structure took shape. Jean learned how to endure before she ever learned how to hope. She did not grow up with the habit of complaint, nor was she taught that the world would wait until she felt ready. Instead, she developed a deeply American, deeply Midwestern reflex: silence, work, and keep moving forward. That explains why, later on, when she entered music, Jean Shepard never went looking for the spotlight. She was not driven by the need to be seen. What she needed was firm ground, a position that would not shift, a place where she could exist without asking permission or compromising herself in order to be accepted. But it was here, too, that the seeds of tragedy were quietly planted. Someone who learns to stand firm too early often never learns how to rest. Someone accustomed to enduring in silence can carry pain for far too long without realizing it. Jean Shepard emerged from that childhood with a rare kind of endurance, and with a quiet fracture as well, the instinct to stay for an entire lifetime, even as the cost of staying grew heavier than anything others could see. When Jean Shepard arrived in Nashville in the early 1950s, the city already had its rules. The big stories were told by men. The most important stages were built around male voices. Women were present, but rarely considered figures meant to last. Jean stepped into that world without illusion. She did not believe that a good voice alone would be enough. In Nashville at that time, a woman who wanted to exist had to learn how to stand her ground long before she was ever allowed to shine. Those early years passed in a strange in-between state, being heard, yet kept at the margins. Jean sang, Jean recorded, Jean appeared, but always within an invisible boundary, as if her presence were permitted only up to a certain point. Then, in 1953, a Dear John letter appeared. No preparation for history, no grand introduction. The song spread quickly, carrying an emotional rawness too exposed to be ignored. When it reached #1, Jean Shepard stepped into a milestone that very few women in country music had reached before her. But that moment did not swing a door wide open. It merely allowed Jean to stand at the threshold a little longer than most. Success came early, and it came quietly. Jean was heard more often on the radio. Her name was mentioned more frequently. Yet the real decisions still remained beyond her reach. History remembers the moment. Everyday reality forced Jean to continue defending her place, day by day, inside a system that had never truly been built for women to remain for the long haul. Jean did not respond with rebellion, nor did she linger in celebration. She did what had always come most naturally to her. She kept working, kept standing her ground, kept letting her voice prove its worth, without the need for added shine. From very early on, Jean Shepard understood an uncomfortable truth. Entering history is one thing. Being allowed to exist within that history is a much longer battle, and that battle had only just begun. By 1955, Jean Shepard's path led her onto a stage that, for many, required only a single appearance to be called a career, the Grand Ole Opry. But for Jean, this was not a symbolic visit. It was an official foothold, a place meant to be stayed in. In a world where women were often invited on stage as temporary accents, Jean's induction into the Opry carried a very different meaning. She didn't arrive to impress and then move on. She arrived to become part of the structure, quietly, steadily, and not easily replaced. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, Jean Shepard's voice rang out regularly from the place country music considered its own heart. No loud promotional campaigns, no polished image. Audiences listened because they trusted that voice, a sound that didn't try to comfort, didn't soften sorrow to make it more palatable. Jean became an icon in a very different way. Not because her name was mentioned the most, but because she was always there. During this period, there were no major titles bestowed to neatly frame Jean Shepard's success. Country music at the time was still accustomed to honoring those who represented explosion, new trends, easily consumable images. Jean, with her raw, honky-tonk faithful voice, stood for something far harder to inscribe on a list of achievements. Consistency. And that consistency began to place Jean in a strangely isolated position. She was at her peak, yet not at the center of the era taking shape around her. As Nashville grew brighter, cleaner, more radio-friendly, Jean Shepard held fast to her way of storytelling. She didn't stretch notes to soften emotion. She didn't bend her voice to suit the majority. Her songs continued to speak of separation, loss, and unresolved endings, as if the world around her had never changed. And Jean chose to remain still while everything else shifted. And that stillness, born of loyalty, gradually carried a very real consequence. No one said she was wrong. The spotlight simply began to look elsewhere first. Jean Shepard was not pushed off the stage. She was still there, night after night. But the story of the era no longer revolved around her. Success remained, but it grew quiet, less named, less explained, less celebrated. And within that prolonged silence, an unspoken question took shape, without ever needing to be said aloud. To stay true and keep oneself, or to change in order to continue existing. Jean Shepard still chose to stay, but the cost of that choice was only just beginning to reveal itself. For a time, Jean Shepard believed she had finally found something that neither her childhood nor her career had ever allowed her to have, a place to let her shoulders rest. A life that did not require a stage, a man who understood the constantly shifting rhythm she carried with her every single day. That marriage was not loud. It was not a fairy tale. But it was enough for Jean to believe that after so many years of standing on her own, someone was finally standing beside her. Then, in March 1963, that belief vanished in a moment too fast to even understand what had happened. The plane carrying Hawkshaw Hawkins Jr. never came back. No warning, no chance to prepare, just a cold piece of news and a void with no shape. The tragedy did not arrive like a great storm. It came like the rug being pulled out from under her. Everything Jean had been leaning on disappeared at once. There was no time to collapse in stages, no escape route from reality. The sense of loss did not spread gradually. It struck straight at the center of her life, leaving everything else terrifyingly fragile. And what many people failed to notice was this: Jean Shepard did not stop. She still stepped onto the stage, still stood in her familiar place, still sang the songs the audience expected. But from that moment on, each time the lights came up, Jean carried more than her voice. She carried a pain that had not yet found a name. There was no pause for proper mourning, no space to truly fall apart. Only one option remained: to keep going, because if she stopped, everything else would collapse with it. Music slowly changed its role. It was no longer a place where Jean told her own story. It became a shield, a space familiar enough to keep her from facing head-on the void that had just opened in her private life. Audiences heard the sad songs and assumed Jean was expressing emotion. The reality was far harsher. Those songs did not let the pain pass. They kept the pain close, long enough for her to stand steady for one more night. Jean Shepard did not cry in public. She did not disappear. She did not allow herself to collapse. But that very resilience began to take on the shape of a danger, because some losses, when never touched, do not fade away. They sink beneath the surface and wait to resurface in far more brutal ways. From that point on, Jean Shepard's life could no longer be divided into stage and backstage. Everything began to merge. Pain followed her onto the stage, and music followed her home into silence. That shock did not end Jean's career, but it changed the person behind the voice forever. After the death of her husband, Jean Shepard's life did not split into two halves, one for the stage, one for her private world. Those two halves pressed down on each other day after day, leaving no space to breathe. Jean became a mother within a rhythm that allowed no slowing down. Night drives followed one another. Cities slid past the window. Hotel rooms grew so familiar she often no longer knew where she was. Each time she left home, she knew she was leaving behind more than an empty room. And still, she went. There was no other choice. Every night the lights came up on time. The intro played in its proper place. Jean stepped out, stood where she always stood, and did what she had done her entire life: keep everything from falling apart. The audience saw a steady woman. They did not see the moments when Jean stood in the wings, breathing deeper than usual, as if slowing down by even a single beat might cause everything to shatter right there. Songs about separation, about loss, about things that could never be fully spoken. They were no longer performances. They clung to her. They followed her off the stage. They followed her home into silence. The line between singing sorrow and living inside it slowly disappeared. Jean did not allow herself to collapse, not because she was stronger than others, but because there was no one else who could collapse in her place. The music continued to sound, but it was no longer a place of release. It became a harsh discipline. The thing that kept Jean standing upright even as she was growing weary inside. The applause at the end of each night did not bring relief. It merely marked that she had made it through one more evening without letting a crack show. But prolonged silence has its own way of collecting its debt. There were mornings when Jean woke to a frightening emptiness, not because the pain was overwhelming, but because she had grown accustomed to never allowing herself to feel. Her body kept functioning. The tour schedule remained intact, but joy, the thing that once made music feel alive, began to withdraw, very slowly, very deeply. Jean Shepard stayed with music. But now, she was not there because of a dream. She was there because if she stopped, everything else would collapse with it. And from this period on, a movement almost impossible to reverse began to take shape. Not a loud downfall, but a prolonged erosion, quiet enough that when the era changed, Jean Shepard was no longer standing at the center of the story. No one took her place away, and the world simply shifted away from her, little by little. When country music began to change in visible ways, Jean Shepard did not leave. She also did not chase after it. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Nashville slowly took on a different face. The sound grew smoother, the image more carefully polished. Songs spoke less about fractures and more about emotions that traveled easily over the airwaves. Country music was learning how to be friendly to radio, to television, to a broader market. Jean Shepard remained there, with the same voice that had carried her through decades. No added gloss. No change in the way she told stories. Her songs still carried sorrow that had not been softened, as if the world around her had never changed its rhythm. And so, a distance formed. There was no announcement declaring Jean outdated, no decision that removed her from the stage. Invitations simply began to thin out. The central spots were no longer reserved for her. The spotlight, once familiar, now sought new faces, new sounds, better aligned with the breath of the era. Jean Shepard still appeared at the Grand Ole Opry, still stood exactly where she had always stood. But the story of country music had turned new pages, and she was no longer the line read aloud the most. Some artists respond to that moment by changing. Jean did not. She did not reshape herself into a younger version. She did not soften her voice to make it easier to hear. She did not rewrite who she was, just to be called again one more time. Jean chose to remain exactly as she was, and that choice carried a very particular feeling. Being left behind without being removed. She still belonged to this place, but she was no longer at its center. A quiet presence, solid enough not to disappear, yet distant enough to no longer shape the collective direction. For Jean Shepard, this was not failure, but it was not victory either. It was the condition of someone who had gone far enough to understand that there are moments when staying intact means accepting a position outside the main current. Jean did not leave country music. Country music, in its newer form, left Jean. And within that distance, her role slowly changed. No longer the voice leading an era, but the one preserving its memory. Quietly, steadily, and never entirely replaceable. As the distance between Jean Shepard and the new era grew more visible, she did not turn it into a battle, nor did she disappear to make herself missed. Jean Shepard simply continued doing what she had done all her life, stepping onto the stage, singing in her own way, then quietly walking back into the wings. The years passed. Country music kept changing, faster and wider. New names arrived, new faces flared into view, then faded away. And within that constant flow, Jean still appeared at the Grand Ole Opry, night after night, decade after decade, like something that required no promotion yet could never truly be replaced. She did not seek the spotlight. She did not attempt a comeback. She did not rebuild old glory through stories of the past. Jean Shepard never lived as someone who needed to be constantly seen. She rarely spoke about what she had endured. She did not claim credit. She did not revisit victories. And she never demanded gratitude from an industry that has always looked forward. Some might call that humility. But for Jean, it felt more like instinct. She did not need the world's daily validation to know where she belonged. And if you look closely, you begin to see a deeper reason why Jean remained at the Opry for so many decades, even after she was no longer at the center of the story. It was not for fame. Fame to Jean Shepard was something that came and went, like seasonal winds across the fields where she once grew up. The Opry was different. It did not demand a new version of her. It did not force her to sing with the trend. It did not require proof that she was still relevant. It offered her something rare, the feeling of belonging. After losses that could never be undone, after the outside world changed direction again and again, Jean Shepard seemed to hold on to the Opry the way one holds on to an old house. Not because it is perfect, but because it is the only place still standing when life has shifted too much. She stayed not to be remembered. She stayed because, in a deeply human sense, she did not want to lose another home. And it was that staying, quiet, enduring, without demand, that turned Jean Shepard into something larger than a singer, a living memory of traditional country music, standing on its own stage, as if her presence alone meant that a piece of old America had not yet disappeared entirely. Jean Shepard's legacy was not built on staggering numbers. It formed more slowly, through presence, through time, and through staying long enough to become part of country music's foundation. In years when women were often treated as voices merely passing through history, Jean Shepard was among the very few allowed to remain at the Grand Ole Opry for the long haul. Not as a decorative exception, but as a full member, standing on the same stage, with the same obligations, the same endurance as anyone else. That sustained presence quietly created a new reality, that the women who followed, like Loretta Lynn, Connie Smith, or Patty Loveless, could enter country music without having to ask permission to exist there for the long term. Jean never turned that into a slogan. She lived it. Musically, Jean Shepard's legacy lies in how she kept honky-tonk and traditional country from being washed away as Nashville moved into waves of pop influence. While many voices chose to soften sorrow to make it easier to broadcast, Jean continued to sing stories left unresolved. Across decades, she proved something that seemed paradoxical. Country music does not need to modernize in order to survive. It needs to be lived truthfully. That endurance was eventually recognized by history. The major honors did not come early, but when they did, they marked a lifetime, not a moment. Jean Shepard was honored by the leading institutions of country music, received Lifetime Achievement Awards, and was ultimately inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Not as a star who burned brightly, but as a pillar who kept the ground from collapsing. Yet if her legacy stopped at awards, it would still be incomplete. What truly set Jean Shepard apart was a rare professional character, an artist who neither withdrew nor competed for attention. She stayed without demanding to be named. She claimed no credit. She did not resurrect old glory to secure her place. For decades, she became the Opry's quiet backbone, present so consistently that her value was only fully understood when one imagined her absence. And deeper still, Jean Shepard represented a distinctly American kind of greatness: endurance without display, loyalty without the need for validation, a lifetime of work without demanding immediate reward. It is a kind of greatness that becomes visible only when it is gone. Jean Shepard did not leave behind a loud legacy, and she left behind solid ground, a place where country music once stood, once lived honestly, and once did not betray itself. And in the history of a genre that never stops changing, there may be no legacy more enduring than that. The story of Jean Shepard does not close with a moment anyone could label as the last. There was no farewell concert, no announcement of departure. She was simply there, long enough for the lights to change direction without the need for notice. Jean Shepard did not abandon country music, and country music did not truly abandon her. The two merely drifted apart, quietly, in the way only time knows how to do. Looking back across the entire journey, what lingers is not how many songs once filled the radio, nor how many honors arrived after everything had already faded. What remains runs deeper, a profoundly human choice, to stay with what one believes is right, even when the world no longer waits at the center. Jean Shepard lived her entire life that way. She did not try to defeat her era. She did not attempt to escape it, and she stood still and let the era pass on its own. Perhaps that is a rare kind of courage, the clarity to understand that not every life needs a dramatic turn to become whole. And in the end, this story is not only about Jean Shepard. It speaks to anyone who has ever stood before the choice between continuing to change in order to remain or slowing down to avoid losing oneself. If this story touched something familiar in you, leave a comment and share your thoughts. And if you wish to keep listening to the stories behind the spotlight, lives that are not loud, yet leave a resonance that lasts, subscribe to the channel and continue these journeys with us. Thank you and see you again in the next video.